All right, gentlemen. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you today for the Whistleblower Summit and Film Festival, discussing blowing the whistle on propaganda networks, analysis and studies of suppression tactics against academics and scientists. So today with us is myself, Richard Ellefritz, Ed Rankin, Daniel Broudy, and John Frame. This will be the order of the presentations for today, in which we will be discussing discourse analysis of media war violence on empirical reality, what happens when scientists and academics question mainstream media in a general way. So I have the honor of doing the first presentation, and then Ed will speak, and then Daniel, and then John, and we will have a brief discussion afterwards to summarize our main points. So to get started, my presentation that I will be discussing is on what I titled Risk Society, Recurrency, and Whistleblowing. So my name's Richard Ellefritz. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the University of the Bahamas. My doctoral work was on the 9/11 truth movement, and I have also studied corruption generally, conspiracy a little bit more specifically, and even more specifically, the nature of conspiracy theories and society. And so that will be some of the theme of what I'm discussing today. If anybody needs to contact me, it's my first and last name at Gmail, and I'll be happy to share this presentation where I've included links to the resources that I'll be discussing. So moving forward, I'd like to discuss this idea of risk society, and we all kind of understand what it's like to live in a risk society. So this is a graphic that a news system had presented to their audience on risk-based guidelines related to COVID-19. And so it's a color-coded chart with some different levels or stages of risk associated with this virus in the pandemic. This is very similar to the color-coded charts that were in use in the months and years after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. And after those attacks, Ulrich Beck revisited his thesis of the World Risk Society. So for more sources on risk societies, you can see Ulrich Beck. It says, what do events as different as Chernobyl, global warming, mad cow disease, the human genome, the Asian financial crisis, and September 11th have in common is that they're all a part of this World Risk Society. So essentially what's going on is that there are risks, hazards, dangers, potential disasters that go on in many different forms. And we have to better understand these events and processes so that we can better respond to them. One of the issues that David Althien brings up in his book, Terrorism and the Politics of Fear, is that risks are not just existential, but they're sometimes politically constructed and managed. So the use of the color-coded charts can engender a perceived risk that not always matches the reality of the situation. You can read the book for more on that. But the point here is that people in the world have to think about the dangers of things like terrorism or pandemics, financial meltdowns. And so I found a presentation by a person who did just that. And the presentation is called Recognizing and Avoiding Cognitive Traps in Security Planning. Are We Safe? And I'm just going to show a few of their slides that I found, and I found interesting for my purposes. And so they have a slide about the beginning of the presentation, and it just looks like this: macro problem, 9/11 conspiracy. Now, typically when we use the word conspiracy, people use it to mean something that's untrue, so a conspiracy theory. But the official account of 9/11 is that there were 19 terrorists who conspired to engage in the events that manifested in that day. So any way you slice it, 9/11 was a conspiracy. But what they're talking about here are 9/11 conspiracy theories as a problem in society. But moving on from that, they revert back to the original official accounting of the events and say, how could this have happened? There are competing narratives. In the 9/11 Commission, it's the most important failure. The most important failure was one of imagination. They say, but there were some other books, some were critical assessments of agency failure, that there were people who had advanced warnings of the attacks, but they weren't able to cooperate or coordinate their efforts. Then the presentation goes on to discuss national security failures. And I found this very interesting for our purposes. So this year at the Whistleblower Summit Daniel Ellsberg heroic work is being honored. And here they're calling it a national security failure. So in this regard, they view people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden and Daniel Ellsberg and certainly WikiLeaks and Julian Assange as villains, as threats to national security, and they think of ways that they can overcome these risks to their organizations. And so there's this battle over the legitimacy of society's organizations, institutions, and how the public relates to them in terms of the information that we have about them. So this leads to an idea called recurrency, failure to follow through on a duty or trust, behaviors of persons and or of institutions that hold positions of trust, agency, responsibility, and their inability to follow through with them. So recurrency is a behavior in a manner that fails to fulfill the obligations of merit or trust. Another sentence that I think can help us understand what it is I'm trying to talk about today is this idea that secret plots are dangerous not because they harm one individual person, but because they undermine society as a whole and democratic principles in general. So for instance, if the press or the news media are not doing their job at being the watchdog of government, but as compared to being a lapdog of government, then what leads people to trust the information that they're getting from that institution protected in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights? So these are important issues because trust is one of the underlying foundations of the ability to have a democratic society. So people like James O'Keefe, who I had the pleasure of seeing at the Freedom Festival conference just yesterday in Rapid City, South Dakota, undermine the trust of news media organizations by entertaining whistleblowers. And so this was a presentation that I saw, and I took these pictures of James O'Keefe, who brought out on stage 5 whistleblowers that were involved in various ways of informing the public that, for example, news media are censoring the stories that journalists that you see before you wanted to cover. And so these are very important issues because these journalists believe that it's their job to inform the citizenry to engage in that democratic principle of a fully informed, self-governing population. So they blew the whistle on these organizations, and somebody like James O'Keefe provides that ability for them to do so, which necessarily is pointing out the recurrency or the failure to engage in trustworthy behavior on the part of these institutions. So because whistleblowers come forward, because we know that this is a fact, it's possible that the only time that conspiracies happen is when, is when a whistleblower comes forward. So this logic comes from the CIA dispatch 1035-960, which was designed to employ propaganda assets to answer and refute proposed conspiracies about the Warren Commission and the JFK assassination. So here on item C, we can see that it says, conspiracy on the large scale often suggested would be impossible to conceal in the United States, especially since informants could expect to receive large royalties. Basically what they're saying is that a large scale conspiracy is impossible because somebody would leak the information. There would be a whistleblower, somebody would want to get rich or famous or just engage in their patriotic sense of duty. And that's why large scale conspiracies don't happen. So in the next presentation, Ed Rankin will pick this idea up a little bit more. And you can also read about it in Lance DeHaven's great book on conspiracy theory in America. Now, there was a rebuttal to that in the book that's referenced just to the right of Lance DeHaven's book. And so you can make up your own mind what you believe about the nature of the origins of the conspiracy theory meme that operates in the discourse of our language in the United States. So this is important to understand because it shapes the way that we think about the organizations and institutions in society that are ostensibly protecting our nation, that are informing us about what's going on in the world. And what conspiracy theories do is they undermine the trust and the legitimacy of these organizations and institutions. So let me give you an example from my research and background. So these are screenshots of 2 different web pages about 9/11 whistleblowers. And on the left here, we can see James Corbett has said, but someone would have talked, say the self-styled skeptics who believe the government's official conspiracy theory about 9/11. But there's a problem with this logically fallacious non-argument. Someone did talk. There are 9/11 whistleblowers. So these 2 organizations, so this would be James Corbett from the Corbett Report and Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, are addressing this idea that that whistleblowers didn't come forward. So in this case, there were people who came forward that had insider knowledge that goes beyond this idea of institutional failure by the CIA and FBI. So you can read more about this by following up with the information 9/11 whistleblowers that you can plug into your favorite search engine. The point being is that these organizations have to confront this logical argument, which they say is fallacious, that there were no whistleblowers, because in fact, there are people who are whistleblowers for 9/11. And their stories compete with the official narratives about that event. And in fact, because of the nature of the conspiracy theorist meme, there was a public relations campaign that some of these people engaged in to say, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm an Air Force pilot. I'm a structural engineer. I'm a first responder. I'm somebody with insider knowledge. And these people are saying, I don't appreciate being called a conspiracy theorist because I'm trying to carry out the whistleblower function. But because of the nature of conspiracy theories in our discourse, oftentimes these people are dismissed as crazy or kooky, or too far outside of polite discussion to be allowed a legitimate place in discussions about that particular event. And so I wanted to tie this into this idea of the function of whistleblowers in society. There's a recent article that came out that says the conspiracy theory defense in response to whistleblower accusations, turning a hero into a villain. And so the point is that because it's commonly understood to be a conspiracy theorist is to be ridiculous, is to be stigmatized, is to be somebody who you don't have to take seriously. And they might even be a threat to democracy, that a whistleblower who is trying to expose the corruption or even the secret illegal acts that groups of people are carrying out, which is a conspiracy, they could just be accused of themselves being conspiracy theorists and not being taken seriously. Imagine if Daniel Ellsberg came out and with his papers, and people just said, "Well, that's kind of conspiratorial. We don't want to look into it because it's not going to be taken seriously." This is the case in many regards when we dismiss what people are saying about their insider knowledge about events, when those events have just been labeled off limits for interrogating in ways that are dismissible as conspiracy theories. And so, for example, early on in the coronavirus pandemic, there were people who were arguing that the virus responsible for the pandemic was likely leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China. There were journalists who, had these people on their shows, and there were politicians, well-known public figures who were discussing this. But on social media sites, oftentimes those discussions were censored. And this is well known to be the case that Facebook was taking down posts and discussions of people talking about this. And they were fact checking it, basically saying that it was a conspiracy theory, it was misinformation, disinformation. And now we know that that this idea is being taken more seriously. And so the concern is, what in society exists today that people dismiss as mere conspiracy theory, misinformation, or disinformation, that we know that powerful organizations like the White House, the Facebook, other big tech social media organizations are censoring our ability to discuss the possible corruption or conspiracy or even just accidental leaks from labs, if that's the case. What does that do to democratic society? What does that do to our ability to just engage in free discourse with our fellow human beings? And in the end, what it does is it identifies this word recurrency, that recurrency is going on. There are people who are in positions that are based upon trust or obligations or duties or responsibilities, and they're not following through with those behaviors. And sometimes going beyond failure to follow through, but actively disrupting the institutional purpose of allowing people to talk, to freely discuss, to question authority. So, for example, it's not just Facebook or the White House. There's a European Commission that has been put together to identify conspiracy theories in similar ways to what the CIA dispatch 1035-960 was doing, was saying they need to work with journalists and authors and academics and others to identify the conspiracy theories in society so they can refute them. And so these are, for example, pamphlets put out by this European Commission to stop the spread of what they're calling dangerous conspiracy theories. And if you read closely in their pamphlets, you'll see that what they were saying is a dangerous conspiracy theory is now actually being taken more seriously, because it could have been the case that, for example, the COVID virus did leak from the Wuhan lab. But there are organizations out there actively trying to dismiss those as unthinkable, as unquestionable, as discursive terrain that you're not supposed to wade into. And so that's my presentation on the topic of risk society, recreancy, and whistleblowers. Is the function of whistleblowers in society is to be able to discuss their insider knowledge. But if they are dismissed as conspiracy theorists and not taken seriously, then we'll be misdiagnosing how it is that we can treat the problems that exist within our modern risk society. And so with that being said, I will pass off the baton to Ed Rankin, who will go a little bit into more depth about the nature of the conspiracy meme and how it functions within our popular discourse.
As Rich pointed out, the Central Intelligence Agency played a role in the development of the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist as a pejorative in our language. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that was done. And, you know, I think sometimes I see a lot of the discussion of the deep state and, you know, how could it, if you go back to the whole concept of hegemony, and it's how people who are in control of the society actually control it, and through nonviolent means. And so, you know, it's controlled by, actually, they control all the systems. So therefore, they're in position to control things like media and sources of information for the general population. So, and C. Wright Mills wrote about this a lot, and he talks about lack of awareness, consciousness, or disconnection from reality among people. And he made a comment, which is interesting, I think. You know, he said that what men are interested in is not always what is to their interest. The troubles they are aware of are not always the ones that beset them. Increased awareness is not enough, for it is not only that men can be unconscious of their situations, they are falsely conscious of them. And of course, the propaganda and the control of the information sources leads us to creates a situation where perhaps what we're being exposed to is actually not factual in reality, but it's what our the folks who run things, what they want us to see and hear and believe. So, as Rich pointed out, the Central Intelligence Agency, after the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission report on the Kennedy assassination, which suggested that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin, the American public didn't buy it. And there were a couple of books that were on the New York Times bestseller list. One called Rust to Judgment, written by Mark Lane, was on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while. And so, you know, the hegemons, the deep state, the folks who run things, decided they couldn't allow the public's suspicion or public's distrust of the Warren Commission's finding about the Kennedy assassination to persist. So the CIA created a program to actually counteract that. And so the CIA created a list of arguments, and Rich pointed out one, it'd be impossible to conceal such a large scale conspiracy. No significant new evidence has emerged, that these people are wedded to theories adopted before the evidence was in, politically interested, financially interested, hasty and inaccurate in the research, and that they produce no new evidence. New culprits have been convincingly identified. So the CIA created a whole list of counter arguments to the questions that the media might have about the Warren Commission's findings and the official narrative, official explanation for the Kennedy assassination. And you can see, just if you do a simple Google search, you can track the use of the term conspiracy and theory together. And you see it's we have an uptick really prior to probably prior to the Kennedy assassination. You didn't hear the term conspiracy theorist used very often. You see it being used now with in the 60s. You see upticks during the Nixon administration and Iran-Contra and other things, and you see an uptick again around 9/11. So you can see where the media is kind of connecting conspiracy theories with current events. And you see these being played out in current media. The claim that it would be possible to conceal such a large-scale conspiracy. Michael Shermer, who's a frequent guest on the news channels, Glenn Beck, who's a conservative talk show host, Kurt Eichenwald, who's a Newsweek senior writer. You see them basically presenting the same argument that the CIA had in its original plan and document. Same thing, Bill O'Reilly claimed that further speculative discussion only plays in the hands of the opposition. You see that with conservative and liberal experts and talk show hosts. So, the labels, particularly in academia, Noam Chomsky, who's, a favorite among a lot of left-leaning academics and others, he said that the conspiracy theorist label is intellectual equivalent of four-letter words and tantrums. So its impact in academia has been substantial. It's labeling somebody a conspiracy theorist is a tactic employed as a strategy of subjugation. So you'll find that as Rich pointed out, even the discussion of conspiracies, even widely held conspiracies, theories that they're widely held among the general public, don't make it in the news media because it's not even considered worth discussing outside the sphere of legitimate controversy. It's not engaging in the game of truth defined by those in power. Subjugated knowledges, insufficiently elaborated. They've been disqualified as inadequate. And the detail is in my dissertation, which was published in 2017, and the link is here in the presentation. So now I'll turn it over to Dan Broudy.
Thanks, Ed. Just a quick introduction. My name is Daniel Broudy. I have been in Japan for a number of years now, working, teaching. If I think back about how I came to this area of research, I think probably it goes back to my youth when I was studying the fine arts, elementary school, middle school, high school in Pittsburgh. Every Saturday morning, I would be at the local museum, Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the Scaife Gallery. And I was just fascinated, spent significant time there, fascinated by works of art and how art, the visual, moved me, moved my friends, how it struck us. And so I think that I have been naturally interested in the world of the visual, how sound moves us, how it can be used to not just move our emotions, but to deceive us. So my main area of research, I'm trained as a linguist, but I look at visual rhetoric and how the visual world, how it affects our perceptions, our understanding of the world, and sorts of conclusions that we draw about the world. So I titled this talk, War's Essentials. I think sometimes it's good to begin with the obvious. War necessitates control over the battlefield and over information. Since at least Panama, when I was serving in the military, I've seen how corollary wars unfold, the information wars that are waged on publics. Since I was in the Intel Corps, I could see the stark difference between the pervasive mediated reality conjured up by corporate forms of journalism and empirical reality, where facts are gleaned from observed phenomena. Of course, this is not entirely surprising, since the military trained us quite well to discern patterns of threat by observing how the enemy organized its forces against us in air, ground, naval orders of battle. Bush declared that an invasion of Panama was necessary to bring order and democracy back to the nation. But everyone knew that Panama, since the construction of the canal was never really a functioning democracy and where the will of the people is respected. So this claimed necessity to legitimize aggression in the interest of some phantom democracy had me quite baffled as a young man arrayed in my battle dress uniform. It's not surprising I became interested in this chasm between these two kinds of reality, empiricism, and the creative production of media narratives. Some years later, while trying to erase my own memories of the mayhem and bloodshed in Panama, I began work on a Ph.D. in psycholinguistics to try to grasp how language, the signs and symbols of thought can be used to address stress, anxiety, and apprehension. Shortly after I began, the events of 9/11 unfolded. And as we all know, the world changed. If it weren't for the menace of Noriega or Saddam Hussein seeking to fortify Iraq's neonatal wards, who could have seen how the new threat from a Middle Eastern madman would expose key trends in foreign policy? I think what's been most fascinating to me is the extent to which war necessitates not just destruction of infrastructures and lives, but also communications and channels of communication. Research in neuroscience and linguistics can reveal how cognitive frames and media frames serve the aims of power. For example, if we are to believe the blueprint for bolstering America's defenses, published precisely 1 year before the events of that fateful day, then the 9/11 narrative, in fact, framed the new Pearl Harbor, that catalyzing event that precipitated revolutionary change. Now, in order for 9/11, the political narrative to remain intact, physics, engineering, architecture, and metallurgy had to be systematically destroyed. While many scholars refer to this section of the blueprint, other sections are also just as relevant to today's war on human perception. Consider the transformations we are told will unfold in the art of warfare on air, land, and sea, and how combat will likely take place in new dimensions, space, cyberspace, and the world of microbes. Well, I thought about this a lot since 9/11, and I struggled for 6 years to finish my work in linguistics. 1 full year required study in the ethics of scientific experimentation on human subjects. When the ethics committee was finally satisfied my experiment would pose no psychological harm, my proposal was accepted. Big Pharma struggled for 6 months, however, to gain control over societies around the world. And they provide no evidence that their experimentations on human subjects are ethical and safe. And when people demand to see unaltered raw data of injuries and deaths, they receive nothing but psychological harm from mainstream pharma media, obsessively censoring any points of view that differ from the approved script. The top managers of the CDC's Tuskegee syphilis study, 1932 to 1972, enacted against Americans of African descent, I think would marvel today at the breadth of today's global experiment. The bread and circuses offered nowadays illustrate how empirical reality must be controlled, made increasingly mediated and virtual, since free, open, and direct engagement with the unmasked world beyond the socially distanced is being made increasingly hideous. Today's trends in which issues are framed, the agitation and integration propaganda that regiments the public mind, like an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers, and the persistent repetition of conditioned responses reveal that the citizenry is in a highly abusive relationship. The owners of the infrastructure and systems of public awareness who pose as figures of authority and beneficent fathers invest in, finance, and profit this relationship. So how can we know? In a country that cherishes free speech, enshrined in a Bill of Rights, the owners suppress the free exchange of alternative views that threaten the prevailing business model. This pattern has emerged to show us total control is on the rise. The transnational elites who have no stake in our future know that the hearts and minds of the masses must be continually occupied by the sounds, signs, symbols, colors, and images of the prevailing narrative, so that no thought or word will deviate from their directives. I pray, nevertheless, in memory of my favorite American, a warrior against segregation and discrimination, that repentance brings us back together as a nation, that we will one day join hands and sing in the words of that old spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. Thank you. I'd like to pass it over to John Frame, who will discuss the pervasiveness, the sheer pervasiveness of propaganda. John, can you pick it up?
Okay. Well, thank you. It's a lot to follow up on with you guys, and I really appreciate it. I'm just learning a lot of things myself, listening to everything going on. Briefly, I was born in Los Angeles, went to UCLA, and graduated Loyola Law School. I got interested in symbolism and media through reading a lot of Jungian stuff, and really Marshall McLuhan. I'm on the board for New Explorations, which was started by McLuhan way back in the 50s, and I've written a number of articles there. I've written a book called Battle of Symbols, published in Switzerland, about global dynamics and symbols, written right after 9/11, and it was written around right around there, published in 2002. So also I'm founder of Midnight Oil Studios, which I've blogged about 400 blogs since 2016, and you can check it out at midnightoilstudios.org is my site. I'm going to talk a little bit about the basically what we're talking about, what the film festival part of everything is going to be about this week. And we start out with really whistleblower films from Hollywood. There'll be whistleblower films by independents, but the ones that we've all seen, most of us have seen, have been some of the most popular films Hollywood has come out with. There are a few reasons for this. One is that many of the leading actors and actresses of the times are in these films. They're very, they're very advantageous for careers. People want to be in these, so they've got a lot of famous actors in those. The other thing is that they confront situations that many are concerned about today. But in addition, they offer subliminal benefits, not always apparent. For one thing, they reinforce the belief that heroism is still possible by the average person, that corruption is being fought and taken to the ground by the little person in society. You see some of the areas that pretty much subtextual areas around the popularity of whistleblower films. And this is really talking about whistleblower films from Hollywood. But really, main reason I think that whistleblower films are popular is that they confront the real villains in society, and the villains in popular screenwriting theory are three. One would be a person, other would be nature, and another would be the system. They confront systems. And as Marshall McLuhan said, they confront a system is really an environment, and an environment is usually invisible to the average person. So you have, and this is kind of pertains to, for example, it's often said that we're not sure who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish. Basically, surrounding environments is what the whistleblower confronts and is able to see. These are some of the whistleblower films in various guises that the systems that have been confronted. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's probably about 30. I did look at these a few days ago, and there's probably about 30 major whistleblower films from Hollywood. And I think there'll be 5 shown later this week with a number of independent films that probably no one has seen yet. Certainly the various villain systems confronted by heroes in the above films represent powerful systems of corruption. Yet despite the large villain systems battled in the above films, none of them confront something as big as the great elephant in the room today. This is a system of corruption surrounding the COVID pandemic and narratives such as origin of the COVID, severity of the virus, need for closure of the economy, wisdom of wearing masks, and the effect of vaccinations. Some of the visuals from that, I mean, there's been thousands, as everybody has seen. And a whistleblower film probably should cover these types of things. Or one aspect of these, I think you could have a whistleblower film just on wearing masks. There's enough people out there questioning that. But I'm just talking about all of the different areas involved with what I term the system of corruption around the COVID pandemic today. And again, thousands of people, we've all seen them in the media, or those that kind of stay away from the regular channels have seen them. We may not have seen these if we've been on the regular channels of communication, but I certainly have seen thousands of, or hundreds of different people questioning COVID today. As Hollywood moves on to their films, there's a lot of independent filmmakers working today. And many are documentaries rather than the scripted Hollywood dramas. They are often not scripted because what is happening is often stranger than anything one could create. The saying, "you can't make that stuff up," has become a popular phrase when commenting on current events. Some of these films will be shown later this week at the film festival, part of the summit. They do not have the special effects, big budgets, and distribution of the Hollywood films, but they represent work in the trenches of whistleblower films. They are not meant to always make the audience feel good that corruption is being defeated. They offer a more realistic assessment of the situation. Many simply raise the issue of corruption and show how hard it is to combat it in the real world. And you see couple of the alternative channels. There's many more than this, but Rumble and BitChute are probably some of the alternative channels most popular, with a lot of the videos being posted to that. At few times in our history, perhaps none, has the government narrative of the world been in such conflict with the empirical reality of so many Americans. Once only 3 television networks and a few newspapers disseminated the government narrative, and alternative views of whistleblowers were few in those years. But with the segmentation of culture and media brought on by the digital world and internet, thousands of other sources are at work each day, defining an alternative narrative to that of the government. In effect, it has become the job of whistleblowers today to propose alternative narratives to the general narrative of the government. Our period might best be described by that opening line from Charles Dickens that many are aware of. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. It is the season of darkness for corruption in the world today. Yet it is also the golden age of light for whistleblowers, constantly inventing themselves in new ways, exposing the darkness of corruption, not fixing the world, but that is the job of each one of us. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Daniel. I think that our presentations held together very well and tell a broad and deep story that many people, I think, would find suspicious due to the nature of what we're talking about, which is one of these paradoxes that is highlighted in this last quotation, that to talk about a conspiracy automatically makes one a conspiracy theorist and thus unreliable or unworthy of dignity and respect. Yet it's the case that whistleblowers are uncovering corruption and conspiracies. And so the empirical reality that they are putting forth into the canon of discourse that we're able to talk about signifies that we live in a time where it's very possible that if we're entering a golden age of whistleblowers, that there is much more going on than we even currently can suspect. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the ability for people to think and question the world around them. As an educator, I take a deep interest in my students' ability to question the world around them, to formulate questions. What is the role of whistleblowers in giving more people that ability? And how is that limited or delimited by these organizations that are propagandizing, withholding information, or just making it otherwise difficult to have these important discussions?
I'd like just to say, from an outsider of the educational establishment, I just was wondering if Richard and Dan feel any type of ostracism or just being an outsider, being interested in whistleblowing by itself. In other words, is that something that's pretty much different from a number of academics today?
Well, the work that I'm doing in Japan sometimes feels as though I'm one among a small handful of whistleblowers, because so many of my colleagues seem to have been taken in by the prevailing narrative that, you know, we're all doomed and we have to obey without question the orders that are handed down to us from on top. So over the past year and a half, because of the masking policies and the social distancing policies, of course, it has been almost impossible to meet with colleagues and share research that we're doing, if we're doing any research, and to exchange ideas. And you know, at this point in the narrative, for me at least, I'm quite surprised by how many people whom I have great respect for, who are brilliant researchers, and who are yet nevertheless quite taken in by all of the propaganda. It's been very difficult, very hard to talk to some of my colleagues about this. While on the other hand, a small handful are very open, if even communicating with me quietly. So there is a kind of an academic pressure and a social pressure to conform, not to speak, and not to think. But surprisingly, I don't see too much pressure around us in the university to not continue as we always have traditionally, in pushing students to think critically. So that has been a nice thing about teaching in Japan. I think Japan still has a very, I think it still has a very open idea about classical education, liberal education, and thinking freely and exchanging ideas. At least that's my impression here where I am. So.
Yeah, and I too teach outside of the United States, and I'm in an environment with somewhat different cultural norms, values, beliefs, but generally, across the world, we see many people who seem to not have the slightest curiosity in how and why, the narratives over time change, and what that means about the trustworthiness of those people who are in institutions and organizations responsible, ostensibly, for dealing in reality. So education being one of those, that ostensibly we are supposed to be teaching our students, if not the truth of reality, how we can better ascertain the truth of reality. And I can tell you that, I too would be considered a whistleblower, because I know for a fact that in some of the textbooks that are published, there are outright myths and falsities that are being presented to these students as if that's the truth or the only truth. And I have some work that I've done to that extent. Certainly my doctoral dissertation is one of the very few out there that goes against the grain. These are things I don't necessarily bring into the classroom situation. Certainly, if I have students who want to bring up a topic and discuss it in a way that would be considered conspiracy theory, I'll try to facilitate the discussion in a way that I think is responsible for the academic setting, and I too have seen, not just the material in textbooks and journal articles, but the discussions by my colleagues who I have an immense amount of respect for their work, their intelligence, dedication to education. But the fact that I hold a different standard for the knowledge that I've acquired through the relatively small groups that I associate with who question the given reality, it really makes me wonder how much, again, recreancy, as I was discussing, is going on. And that means that these educators, like the doctors and scientists who are involved in the response to the pandemic, are misguided simply because they don't want to stray too far out of the official narrative, because that would lead them to be stigmatized, ridiculed, and some of it maybe they know better, but they don't want to speak up because they fear to lose their job or lose respect. And certainly, that's my understanding of whistleblowers is, there are people risking their careers, risking their reputations. And so, in terms of education, there are a lot of people in society who are beginning to question, the sources of some of the ideas that are changing our world around us currently as we live in it. And they're finding that it's in education. It's coming out of colleges and universities, and it has been for decades. And these are people who now run corporate offices or governmental organizations and have a different set of ideas than a large portion of the population. And I think that we're entering a situation where there is going to be a serious debate about who gets to have the legitimate control over the way that we talk about the world around us. And this just goes back to, I think, three of us showed images of the press secretary currently in the White House. And I would say our maybe shared suspicion that she's not being totally truthful with the American people. And the news reporters who then report on what she is saying as if it's the truth. And this is creating a deep divide between two very different types of people in the general population. And this divide has been growing for a long time, but I believe that we're now reaching a point where the indisputable truths that contradict the official accounts of what's going on in the world will be insurmountable. The chasm will be insurmountable. We've reached an impasse, and therefore we need to have a very serious, open, adult discussion about the sources of information around us. And what I think that's going to do is create a situation where there are going to be a lot of people who have to take a serious look in the mirror and really ask themselves what their role has been in supporting the propaganda system that is misleading us and leading us away from the ability to accurately diagnose what is wrong with the world, and therefore provide these solutions that can provide a corrective to things like poverty, inequality, war, genocide, pandemics, financial meltdowns, and things of that nature. So because we've been having the wrong discussions, we've been misdiagnosing the problem and giving the wrong prognosis as well.
Well said.
It's really interesting, Rich, what you said. I mentioned that the heroes in Hollywood films go against the system, but I think heroes are being labeled, whistleblowing heroes are being labeled villains today. And so I think it's an interesting point you made about in your presentation about people that come forward today are not exactly the heroes anymore. So that might be something that I need to rethink. That part of saying heroes in whistleblower films are always they're always the heroes in society. They're not always, they're not labeled that way sometimes.
That's right. And I found a journal article on this idea of how whistleblowers are sometimes converted from a hero status to a villain through the use of the conspiracy theory label. But I also showed a presentation from a professional and an expert who's tasked with identifying risks. And what he's saying is that some of the risks are these whistleblowers, that they're the actual villains. And I've met people, I will say that I recently met a person who works for one of the three-letter intelligence organizations. And he, if I could quote, he literally said that he hates Bradley Manning. And we saw for several months, when Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden were, popular in the news, that they were labeled as traitors and deserve the punishments for traitors, when what those people believed that they were doing was engaged in patriotic activities. So we're really in a battle over the definition of what it means to be a patriotic citizen. Does it mean exposing the wrongdoing of what's going on, holding people accountable? Or does it mean keeping your mouth shut and helping the machine continue to operate as is? And I think that we, and probably a lot of the people watching this, believe whistleblowers are heroes and should be celebrated and given that celebrated status. But there are people who are at risk of their livelihoods, their occupations, because the whistleblowers are basically revealing the fact that they've been engaged in corruption and conspiracy with criminal intent and malice. And so it's not just a financial threat, it's also one that some people could potentially be open to very serious punishments in the criminal justice system. And then we have people who have reported on the fact that the criminal justice system has members that are themselves corrupt, that refuse to prosecute or to sentence, some types of crimes rather than others. And so part of the, seriousness of the situation that we're coming up to is if that recreancy is prominent throughout government, corporations, the educational system, it's going to lead a lot of people to lose their grasp with the reality that they thought that they were living in, because they were not living in the real world. They were living in a constructed fantasy through the symbols, the narratives, the signs and propaganda, and they're going to have to come to the realization that the world does not work the way they thought it did. And it's whistleblowers that are uncovering the indisputable fact that there is systemic corruption and organized conspiracy that operates currently. And that fact, that waking up, it's called a conversion experience, is going to be very difficult for a lot of people around the world. But if we want to be able to live in a just, truthful society, it's something that a lot of adults are going to have to wake up to.
There's some interesting research. It was done by a communications scholar, Herbert Schiller, back in the mid to late 80s. He developed this theory about known as definitional control. And of course, it means precisely what it implies, that people in power are able to shape our understanding and our perception of what is real by virtue of their access, their easy access to the informational infrastructure, which is what he called it, and to define terms or redefine terms in ways that square with the political expediencies, the realities that they want to create or recreate. And so his idea about definitional control has become really quite useful to understand how, for example, we perceive what is real about herd immunity. Perhaps you already know that it was, I believe, October or November of last year when the WHO suddenly changed the long-standing definition of the concept of herd immunity, and where herd immunity could be gained in populations through exposure, natural exposure to pathogens. The WHO was found to have narrowed the definition so that the only way to achieve herd immunity would be through some sort of inoculation. So, of course, this has big pharma written all over it. But it's quite an incredible thing how simple definitions, how when they're manipulated, they can be used to fundamentally manipulate, warp, reshape our concepts of what is actually real, and like you said, creating a falsity,
Yes, and in sociology, we have a well-known maxim called the Thomas theorem, and it goes like this: if people define situations as real, they become real in their consequences. And so we can perceive or interpret the world around us in ways that bring about the reality of the situation simply because of the way that we collectively think about it. And we know that information, for the most part, comes through institutions like education and media and now social media. And one of the things that I presented in my presentation is that there are well-funded intergovernmental corporate sources of what's called anti-conspiracy discourse. And so they are intentionally trying to define the situation as one in which to talk about conspiracy is irrational. And in some cases, they want to make it illegal if they could. There are issues with free speech. And so what has been done, for example, there was a 2008 paper written by Cass Sunstein and his writing partner, Adrian Vermeule, on the nature of conspiracy theories. And they proposed an idea of cognitive infiltration. Yeah. And so they said, because we can't, for example, create a tax or a punishment for people who espouse conspiracy theories, what we can do is we can infiltrate the groups that people operate in, for example, online or at their meetings, and we can begin to nudge them out of their current discourse. We can even introduce, misinformation and disinformation to the extent that we disrupt their operations to make them look ridiculous. Now, I'll say that there was a book-length response to that journal article by David Ray Griffin called Cognitive Infiltration. And just one of the takeaway points of Griffin's book is that the article is so shoddy in terms of scholarly standards that Sunstein must have known how illogical it was and therefore meant the opposite of everything said in it. Now, this isn't like the Orwellian newspeak where you have double think and double speak, where you're using a term in the opposite of its sense, like ironically. This meant that Sunstein is probably an insider who knows the truth of the situation. And the only way that he could tell other people about it was by generating this just terribly illogical argument. So he might have in fact been acting as a whistleblower by generating this article that passed peer review, right, and made these arguments, but the arguments were taken seriously. And so, Ed, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this idea of cognitive infiltration on social media and the introduction and discourse of some of the more, profanely, radical ideas about the world, and then how that's used to sort of, make conspiracy theorists look ridiculous, quote unquote. Do you have any thoughts on the nature and use of social media, the sharing of memes or information that can kind of get people into trouble, and how that functions in society?
Yeah, the whole social media thing is really it's really fascinating to me right now with the censorship that's taking place there. I think just in my own experience, I'm on my third consecutive 30-day suspension from Facebook for posting something that was true, because it violated their community standards in some way. And I've appealed it. Of course, I'm waiting for their response. But I think the control mechanisms that are in place right now, I think it's right for us to be, and we should be extremely concerned, if not fearful, about where this all ends up. Mark Crispin Miller, who I believe you guys know, is a professor of communications at NYU, and he's been under threat of losing his position because in a propaganda studies class that he was teaching, he encouraged his students to look at alternative media explanations or information around the COVID virus. And he simply just said, I would encourage you to consider some of these alternative news sources. And one of the students complained, and now he's under he's under duress from the university for taking that position. And he's a highly regarded, very successful guy, well published and held in esteem by his colleagues. So you only have to. The system only has to punish a guy like Mark Crispin Miller, a couple of people like Mark Crispin Miller, for all their others to get the message, right? And so don't stray too far from the official narrative when you're, whatever you're doing, whether you're conducting research or whether you're writing about research, right? So, I feel, for you guys, Dan and Rich, particularly, you guys are practicing in academia. I can only imagine, and we know from, experiments been done for almost a century that people change their behavior when they know they're being observed. Well, we all know we're being observed today. And so I can imagine if a faculty member or an educator, what sort of self-censorship they're doing now, and just in order to try to stay out of trouble. So I think, it's kind of a war on truth. It really is.
And that's an excellent point. And I was hoping that you would make that because of this idea of definitional control and the definition of the situation, that what is being considered misinformation and disinformation can in fact be empirically, observably verifiable as the fact of the matter, as the truth of the situation. But because it's defined as misinformation, false disinformation, they can then punish you by banning you from engaging in discourse on social media. And social media, it was used in Mark Crispin Miller's case to generate a false sense of popularity with the notion that he should be displaced.
Yes.
So, so I hope people can take away from this idea that when we are engaging with information that insiders, people who have inside knowledge, have brought to the forefront of our attention in the public, that that we're dealing with information that would not otherwise have been presented to us. And that we know that because information that is presented to us can be defined, right, as false, then it's possible that we are entering a situation where one of the barriers to being a whistleblower is that their direct eyewitness testimony will be dismissed out of hand as non-existent, untrustworthy, untrue. And one case that I can bring up in particular is I was at a conference this weekend, and I met one of the people that James O'Keefe brought on stage for Project Veritas. This was the postalman who blew the whistle on the fact that one of his superiors was asking him to backdate mail-in ballots to make it appear as if the mail-in ballots were legitimate when they were not. And we see in the news media that the quote, "There is no evidence of wrongdoing having gone on during the election." They use the phrase, "There is no evidence." This was the same phrase that was used with claims about the World Trade Center 7, Building 7 collapse that Daniel showed a clip of collapsing, that the official response was there was no evidence to the contrary of the government, but they never looked for it in the first place. And so the investigative journalists in the media who are saying there's no evidence are, for example, dismissing this postalman as either non-existent or untrustworthy or saying untrue things. But the problem for them is that, like World Trade Center 7, we have the video evidence. The video and audio evidence is still with us of what they are reporting. It's not word of mouth testimony. And so I think that there is a real situation unfolding where, for example, John, the documentaries about whistleblowers that provide the evidence that you can confirm with your own eyes and ears will be one of those important factors in removing the ability of, let's say, the powers that be to dismiss whistleblowers out of hand.
And it's, Rich, I just remember, you guys probably have seen that image from, I think it was on, I saw it on CNN, I think, but it was with all of these fires in the background last summer, and the whole city's being burned, and then the reporters saying peaceful protests. So that is a direct confrontation of what people are seeing visually with what's going on. So I thought that was interesting, because what they were saying was obviously in conflict at that time. So I do think that documentaries are going to play an important part. It'll be interesting to see what these documentaries will be about this week. I do think Ed had made in his brilliant paper, he said that conspiracy theorists is a type of meme of cultural control, that people are labeled conspiracy theorists. So they are given less importance, and they will not be listened to. And I think that really whistleblower is exactly the same thing. I think this conference could be called a conspiracy theory conference this week, because everybody, I obviously haven't seen the film, but I think that a lot of people are going to have alternative views, although I can't speak for the other panelists and everything, but I do think I see the relationship between conspiracy theorists and whistleblowers is really the same thing today almost. So it's been great.
It's almost a form of gaslighting, isn't it? I mean, there's a form of gaslighting taking place.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, gaslighting is. Yeah, it's interesting. I wrote an article on gaslighting. It's very interesting. Yeah. But I do think that, seeing things with your own eyes, that documentary films, rather than Hollywood films, are going to be as far as film goes, as far as visual presentations go, will be things like what Varieties is doing, some of those short little films that have been taken with iPhones during lunches and everything. I think some of those more might get out, but they're going to get out. They're only going to get out to the alternative media channels. And I'm not sure how long those are going to be up for, some even BitChute and Rumble and some of those. So as long as there's still channels for people to see those, it'll be really helpful. But again, they're going after everything today. And I think it's it's just a really crazy time we live in.
And there have been whistleblowers who have worked with Project Veritas who have shown that employees of Google and YouTube and Facebook have actively sought to control the information that they're presenting for politically motivated reasons. And so there are insiders who have an interest in protecting the institutions responsible for giving us the ability to be a self-governed society. Without a fully informed citizenry and engaged citizenry, we cannot carry out the classical theory of being a republic. And that's just speaking for the United States itself, because we know that we're dealing in a global environment with nation states that don't have the values that are encoded in the Bill of Rights. And they influence the global conversation through the power of markets, and make it economically important for certain organizations to, let's say, to censor the speech of Americans. And this is, again, one of those situations where we need to have very clear discussions about the nature of the world, and one of the things that will be involved are the competing value systems of the world. And I think one of the things that whistleblowers do is they show us that some people value truth and justice, that they know that the public is being lied to, that the public is being treated unfairly, with the expectation that they deserve access to the information that they want to have access to, and that there are individuals who are doing this with the intent to engage in politically motivated behaviors. And so just to repeat myself, I think that whistleblowers really show other people that some people have a commitment to truth and justice.